10 years ago, the world came together at the Paris Climate Summit, marking a historic moment, the first ever global agreement to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The Paris Agreement was hailed as a game changer, a monumental step toward confronting climate change on a worldwide scale. But a decade later, where do we stand? If you look around, it's easy to get lost in the headlines about failed targets, unmet goals, and political disagreements. It feels like there's always a new report telling us how we're not doing enough or how emissions are rising faster than expected. But is that the whole story? What if there's more to this narrative than just doom and gloom? Let's break it down. Over the last decade, we've seen some real progress, even if it's not as fast or as far-reaching as we need. For starters, more and more countries have put climate action at the top of their agendas. Think about it. The Paris Agreement itself didn't just set out a vague promise. It laid down clear targets, and most countries have updated their climate plans to reflect that. Even the U.S., which pulled out under the previous administration, came back in with President Biden, signaling a renewed commitment. But here's the catch. The world's largest emitters, like China, India, and the U.S., are still struggling to meet their promises. Despite all this, one thing is clear: the global conversation has shifted. Climate change is no longer just a topic for environmental activists or scientists. It's front and center in political discussions, in business strategies, in everyday conversations. Let's talk about the numbers because they really matter here. According to a recent report, global emissions have still been on the rise since the Paris Agreement. In fact, we've only seen a temporary dip during the pandemic. But since then, we're back on track to higher emissions than ever. A report from the UN just last year painted a pretty grim picture. At this rate, we're on track to warm the planet by more than 3 degrees C by the end of the century. And if we don't curb emissions soon, the impacts will be disastrous. Wildfires, floods, crop failures, and mass migrations. It's no longer a distant problem, it's a present one. But wait, there's some hope. Even though emissions are up, we're seeing a major shift in how countries and industries are approaching the problem. Renewable energy is booming. Solar and wind power are growing faster than ever, and more nations are committing to net zero targets by mid-century. Take Europe, for example. Countries like Denmark and the UK are pushing hard to reduce their reliance on fossil fuels. They're investing heavily in clean energy, and their economies are showing that it's possible to transition without tanking growth. And then there's the private sector. Big corporations like Amazon, Google, and Apple have made some bold moves towards sustainability. They're not just talking about it, they're putting their money where their mouth is. They've committed to net zero emissions, and they're investing in renewable energy and carbon offset programs. Sure, these companies have their flaws, but they're setting a precedent, showing that it's possible for businesses to be profitable and environmentally responsible. But here's where the real challenge lies: implementation. It's one thing to set goals and sign agreements. It's another to actually make the changes happen. That's where the rubber meets the road. Countries are still struggling with this, especially those that rely heavily on fossil fuels for their economies. There's always resistance, whether it's from powerful industries or the political costs of making tough decisions. What's more, global inequality is a huge factor. Developing nations, many of which are already facing the brunt of climate impacts, are still calling for more support in the form of funding, technology, and capacity building to meet their own climate goals. They argue that the world's wealthier nations should pay their fair share for the damage done, given that they've been historically responsible for much of the emissions driving climate change. So, where does this leave us? 10 years on from Paris, We're still in a race against time. But there's something undeniable about the shift that's taken place. Climate change has moved from the sidelines to the mainstream. And even though we're not where we need to be yet, the momentum is building. More countries are pledging to reduce emissions, businesses are getting in on the action, and renewable energy is on the rise. But we can't afford to be complacent. The next decade is critical. We've set some ambitious targets, and now the question is whether we'll hit them or fall short. If we want to avoid catastrophic consequences, we need to do more faster. The Paris Agreement may not have solved everything, but it has sparked a global movement that no country can ignore. And that's something to hold on to, right? Change isn't always linear, but we're moving in the right direction. It's a shift that's not going to be undone easily, and for that, we should be hopeful. So as we look ahead, let's ask ourselves, are we ready for the next chapter? Because no matter where you are in the world, this is a shift no country can ignore. The next 10 years will decide everything.